The bomb hit 4 hours ago. The power is out. The water stopped running 20 minutes later. Your phone has 11% battery and no signal. You have a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, and the food in your kitchen will last for about 2 days at most. This is not a movie. This is what thousands of families across the Middle East are experiencing right now. The question that determines whether a family makes it or not is not about strength or courage. It's about knowing exactly what to do in the first 72 hours. But here's what nobody tells you. The biggest threat in those 72 hours is not what you think. It's not the bombs. It's not enemy soldiers. It's not even starvation. The number one cause of death in urban war zones after the initial strikes is something so simple that most people never even consider it. I'll tell you exactly what it is. But first, you need to understand the timeline, because in survival, everything is about sequence. Do the right thing at the wrong time and it becomes the wrong thing. Welcome to the $0 Engineer. Subscribe right now, because this information could save your family's lives. The first 12 hours after a strike are what military survival planners call the golden window. This is not because things are good, but because it is the only period where your options are still open. After 12 hours, every decision becomes more difficult, every resource becomes scarcer, and every mistake becomes more costly. So what should you do first? Most people think the answer is water. It's not. Most people think the answer is food. It's definitely not that either. The first thing you do in the golden window is gather intelligence. This may sound complicated and military, but it's actually the simplest thing on this list. In the first 30 minutes, you need to answer 3 questions. Firstly, is my building structurally safe to stay in? Second, are there ongoing strikes in my immediate area? 3. Do my neighbors have injuries that need immediate attention? The answers to these 3 questions determine everything that follows. If your building is compromised, evacuate now while escape routes are still passable. If there are ongoing strikes, you should shelter in place and wait. If neighbors are injured, you must help them now, because they will become your survival network later. However, this is where the first critical mistake is made, and it leads to the number one threat I mentioned at the beginning. Once the immediate danger has passed, most people do absolutely nothing for the next 6 to 8 hours. They sit, they wait, they assume someone will come and help them. In those wasted hours, they miss the only opportunity to secure the one resource that will determine whether they survive the next 72 hours or collapse before help arrives. Water. Not because you'll die of thirst in 72 hours. You won't. The human body can survive for 3 days without water. The reason water is the defining resource is what dehydration does to your decision-making ability. At just 2% dehydration, your cognitive function drops by almost a quarter. You start making bad choices. You misjudge distances. You forget things. You take risks that you wouldn't normally take. In a war zone, one bad decision can cost you more than just your comfort. It could cost you your life. So, where would you find water if the taps stopped working? The answer is already in your home, but you're probably not thinking about it. Your water heater tank holds between 30 and 50 gallons. That's enough to sustain a family of 4 on survival rations for 3 to 4 days. The tank has a drain valve at the bottom. Turn off the power or gas supply to the heater, open a hot water tap somewhere in the house to break the vacuum, and then drain the water from the valve into containers. Most people live within 15 feet of this water supply every day and never consider it as an emergency water source. However, the water heater is just one obvious source. Each of your toilet tanks, not the bowls, holds about 1.5 gallons of clean water. Even after pressure drops, your pipes still contain residual water. Open the lowest tap in your home, and gravity will push out whatever remains in the system. The ice in your freezer is melting right now. That's water. Canned vegetables are packed in water. Even your fruit has a high water content. Here's a detail that most survival guides skip entirely. Your water collection containers matter almost as much as the water itself. Open containers lose water through evaporation and collect airborne debris and dust. In a bombing zone, this dust may contain concrete particles, insulation fibers, and potentially hazardous chemicals. You should seal every container you fill. For example, you could use plastic wrap over a bowl, a lid on a pot, a cap on a bottle. Unsealed water in a dust-filled environment becomes contaminated within hours. A family that collects all available water sources within the first 6 hours will typically have enough to last 5 to 7 days. However, if they wait 24 hours, they will have lost half of it to evaporation, leakage, and contamination from dust and debris. Now you have water. You're probably thinking that the next priority is food, but this is where the second dangerous assumption comes in. This is the one that causes people to move when they should stay still. Food is not your second priority, shelter assessment is. Here's why. At rest, your body burns roughly 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day. Under stress, this figure can climb to 2,500 or more. Every time you move, you burn more calories. The same applies when you carry something heavy. If the lift is out of order and you have to climb the stairs, you burn more calories. The food in your kitchen represents a finite energy reserve. The rate at which you drain this bank depends entirely on how active you are. This is why assessing shelter is more important than finding food in the first 24 hours. If your current location is safe and has resources, you should stay there. You don't move to find food. You don't move to find better shelter. You don't move just because you're scared. Every unnecessary movement uses up calories that cannot be replaced. A family that stays put and ration their food can extend a 2-day supply to 5 or 6 days simply by minimizing movement. In contrast, a family that panics and relocates on day 1 will burn through their energy reserves twice as fast, arriving at their new location exhausted and dehydrated with fewer options than before. But what if you have to move? What if the building isn't safe? What if the strikes are getting closer? This is where most survival advice falls apart, as it assumes that you have time to plan. You don't. The physics of urban movement during conflict are also completely different to what you've seen in films. The first rule of urban movement is counterintuitive. You should move at dawn or dusk, never at night. Every film shows people escaping under cover of darkness. In reality, however, thermal drones can see better at night because the contrast between your warm body and the cool environment is at its greatest. At dawn and dusk, the ground is still releasing stored heat from the day. This means the thermal contrast between you and the ground is at its lowest. You're harder to detect at sunset than at midnight. The second rule is speed. Most people think that faster is safer. Get from A to B as quickly as possible, but the physics says otherwise. Fast movement generates more heat, which increases your thermal signature. It also creates more noise, increasing your acoustic signature. Fast movement also impairs your ability to observe potential threats. The correct speed is slow and deliberate. Move for 2 minutes, then stop for 1 minute to observe and listen before moving again. This sounds painfully slow. It is. It's also the reason why trained soldiers cover ground at roughly 1/3 of the normal walking pace in hostile urban environments. They're not just being cautious for show, they're managing their signatures. But that's only the first layer of the problem. Even if you time your movements perfectly, where you move matters more than when. The single most dangerous thing you can do is follow the crowd. Mass evacuation routes are the first places to be targeted, blocked, or overwhelmed. The roads that everyone knows about become choke points. The bridges everyone uses become bottlenecks. The shelters everyone heads towards become overcrowded within hours. The counterintuitive move is to go perpendicular, not towards the obvious destination, not away from the obvious threat, sideways. Move laterally to a position that is neither the target zone nor the evacuation corridor. Find the neighborhoods that are empty because everyone has left them. These empty areas have abandoned resources and intact structures, and there are no crowd dynamics to deal with. Now you're sheltered and have water, as well as conserving energy. Here's the third assumption that could undo everything you've built. Most people think they need to signal for help as soon as possible. They want to call someone, wave something, or make noise to attract attention. In a stable emergency, yes, but in an active conflict zone, signaling is one of the most dangerous things you can do. Light, sound, and electronic signals all create a signature. For example, a phone searching for a cell tower broadcasts a radio signal. A torch at night can be seen for miles through optics. A fire lit for warmth produces a visible plume and an infrared signature. Even a group of people talking loudly creates an acoustic footprint that directional microphones can detect from hundreds of yards away. In an urban war zone, the safest communication method is to leave physical written messages at predetermined locations. Before any emergency happens, your family should agree on 3 locations within walking distance where messages can be left and collected. For example, a specific park bench, a specific wall inside a specific building, a specific tree in a specific yard. No electronics, no signals, no signatures. This sounds primitive. It is, but it works precisely because it leaves no detectable footprint. Let me summarize everything we've covered, because the sequence is more important than any individual piece. Hours 0 to 6. Assess your building. Collect every drop of water in your home. Help injured neighbors. Do not leave your position unless the building is structurally unsafe. Hours 6 to 12. Take an inventory of all food. Calculate your supply at minimal activity levels. Establish a water rationing plan. Designate one interior room as your primary shelter, away from windows, where you can consolidate your supplies. Hours 12 to 24. Rest. This may sound useless, but it's the most valuable activity you can do. Your body needs time to shift from adrenaline mode to conservation mode. Sleep in shifts. One person should always be awake to monitor changes in the situation. Eat one small meal. Drink water on a schedule, rather than when you're thirsty, because by the time you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated. Hours 24 to 48. If you need to move, plan your route during the day and carry it out at dusk. Move perpendicular to evacuation corridors. Carry only water and documents. Leave food behind if it means you can move faster. You can find food later, but you cannot find speed once exhaustion sets in. Hours 48 to 72. By this point, you should either be in a stable shelter or have reached a safer zone. If you are still in your original location, your main activities are water rationing and conserving energy. This is where mental discipline becomes more important than physical capability. Boredom can be dangerous because bored people make impulsive decisions. Assign tasks. Maintain a watch rotation. Count your water supply twice a day. Talk to your family about the plan. Repeat it and confirm that everyone knows their role. Structure creates calm. Calm preserves energy. Energy is what keeps you alive. Help will come. Infrastructure will be restored. Your job is to make sure you're still alive and functioning when it does. All the families that survive for 72 hours without infrastructure share one trait. It's not fitness, nor is it military training, nor is it expensive equipment. It's the ability to do nothing when every instinct tells them to do something, to sit when they want to run, to conserve when they want to consume, to stay silent when they want to scream for help. It's about trusting the physics of survival over the emotions of crisis. Everything I just taught you costs nothing. No kit, no gear, no bunker. It's just about understanding that survival is a sequence problem, not a supply problem. Do the right things in the right order, and 72 hours is survivable for anyone. However, there's a question that goes deeper than tactics. What happens to your body and mind when those 72 hours stretch into a week? What happens when the food runs out completely and the water sources dry up? We cover the physiology of starvation, the psychology of prolonged crisis, and the 3 decisions that determine who walks out and who doesn't in the next video.